Welcome to this Target 12 special on 12 News, the criminal trial of Aaron Thomas. I'm Target 12 investigator Tim White, and I will be joined by my colleague Eli. For the next half hour, we're going to walk you through, or try to walk you through, the 6-week trial of Aaron Thomas and break it down. It began on April 7th, ultimately ending in Thomas being acquitted of the two most serious charges that he faced: second-degree child molestation and second-degree sexual assault. He was convicted of 2 misdemeanor battery charges. Eli, let's start here. The verdict came down. We were in the room on May 19th. After several days of deliberations by the jury. I want to bring viewers into the room with us to the moment the verdict came down. We have removed the names of the complaining witnesses from this recording. Take a listen to the verdict.
Foreman, does the jury have a verdict?
We do.
In the matter of W2 2022-180A, State of Rhode Island versus Aaron Thomas, as to count 1, how do you find the defendant, Aaron Thomas, as to the charge beyond a reasonable doubt of second-degree child molestation, sexual assault in violation of Rhode Island general laws, to wit, hand to inner thigh or groin?
Not guilty.
As to count 1, how do you find the defendant, Aaron Thomas, to the lesser included offense of simple battery in violation of Rhode Island general law, offensive or unwanted contact?
Guilty.
As to count 2, how do you find the defendant, Aaron Thomas, as to the charge beyond a reasonable doubt of second-degree child sexual assault in violation of Rhode Island general law, to wit, hand to inner thigh or groin?
Not guilty.
As to count 2, how do you find the defendant, Aaron Thomas, to the lesser included offense of simple battery in violation of Rhode Island general law, offensive or unwanted contact?
Guilty.
Mr. Foreperson, is this your true verdict?
It is.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, is as your foreperson says, so say you all?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
So, Eli, we're going to work backwards through this trial here. You know, a lot of people are wondering how the jury came to that verdict because Aaron Thomas, his defense, he admitted in the trial that, yes, he was in a room alone with students who were naked, and he would conduct tests on them. And you and I have repeatedly talked about this. The difficulty for the state, for the prosecution in this case, was intent. Almost every criminal charge comes with 2 things that they have to prove. The act happened. Well, that we know that happened because Aaron Thomas admitted it. But the level of intent here was a challenge for prosecutors, and that level of intent was for the purposes of sexual gratification. Sounds like the jury just did not believe they were able to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yeah, it's such a high bar, Tim,
Yeah.
intent, because essentially you're asking a 12-member panel to get inside of the brain of an individual and understand what it is that exactly that, was their intention.
Right.
And in this case, it was difficult, I think, for the jury because it's not like there was a video of Aaron Thomas doing these tests. And, we'll talk about it a little bit later, but what that meant is that it really came down to his word, which was different than the word of some of these former students who also took the stand and testified that he was doing these things, and that they got at some of what they thought his intent was, but then he got up on the stand and said that wasn't his intent. So you're asking 12 people to agree on what it is that what the purpose was of why he did these tests.
And how do prosecutors try to convince the jury of that? I mean, as you just pointed out, there really wasn't, except for a police video, which we're going to talk about later in the program, there really was no physical evidence here. Physical evidence, is the best way to examples like DNA evidence or something like the smoking gun that prosecutors might have. There was none of that. And so they leaned into witness testimony, and they're really asking the jury to infer that intent, right?
Exactly. One of the things that the prosecution did repeatedly during this trial was hammer away at his credibility Like you said, there was this police video where he lied that we'll talk about. He also lied multiple times to other officials back in 2018 about students not being naked for these tests. And so what the prosecution strategy was to show the jury, listen, this guy lied. We're showing you that he lied multiple times about a key factor in these tests, students being naked. And that's why you shouldn't believe him now when he tells you that his intent was not for sexual gratification or arousal. And, ultimately that 12-member panel came back and they said they couldn't quite. Of course, they did take the battery charges, which was interesting because that's what the defense wanted. It was at the beginning of the trial, Tim, when
Agreed.
The defense attorney actually asked the judge to allow the jury to consider those lesser charges. In order to do that, Aaron Thomas had to waive 3-year statute of limitations in order for that to even be considered, which was granted. And the defense was very pleased. They said as much at the end of the trial about the fact that they took those lesser charges, because essentially what it means is that there is no sex crimes here.
Yeah.
Battery can be as simple as me pushing you to the ground. So
it's a forcible or unconsented touching is the letter of the law on that one. And it is, as you point out, a lesser included offense. And I think that gave that jury and what the defense wanted sort of an escape hatch, that maybe they wanted to hold him accountable in some form, but we're a little unsure about that beyond a reasonable doubt with the intent that you and I have been talking so much about. And look, I reached out to one juror who was part of day one of deliberations. It wasn't a full day. He was dismissed because there was a conflict of interest that arose. We don't necessarily have to get into all that. We don't have time. But it was really interesting to me, Eli. He told me that when he walked into the room on day one of deliberations, most people said not guilty on child molestation, second degree, but most of the room said guilty of second degree sexual assault. Now, he conceded during deliberations his mind might have changed. Reviewing 170 some odd exhibits of evidence and 25 different witnesses, he might have come around as well. But it was really interesting to hear that early on there was some people, or if not by his word, the majority of the room, that was thinking a conviction and on at least one of the felony counts. We're going to have to go to break soon, Eli, but let me just ask you the question. Were you surprised by the verdict?
It's a great question, Tim. I'm not sure I was surprised. It's so hard to predict how a jury's going to come out in a trial. And let's remind people that this was going on this started with witness testimony all the way back on April 7th. Mm-hmm. That is a lot of information over 6, 7, 8 weeks that, the jury had to take into consideration. And there were really, really talented lawyers on both sides of this. The defense attorneys did a really good job trying to protect Aaron Thomas, and the prosecutors did a really good job trying to erode his credibility. So it was a tall order for the jury. I don't think I would have been surprised in any way it came out.
All right. Aaron Thomas is scheduled to be sentenced on June 26th. We'll see if it actually happens on that day. I'm in touch with some of the parents of the witnesses that took the stand, and they're considering whether or not there will be victim impact statements in person on that day. We'll find out. He faces up to 1 year for each of those counts, plus a $1,000 fine. Later in the program, Eli, you and I will break down maybe what could happen there. So let's take a break. When we come back, Thomas took the stand himself. This is pretty rare in a criminal trial for the defendant to take the stand and testify in their own defense. And we'll talk about what it may have meant to the jury. We'll come back in a moment. Welcome back to this 12 News special breaking down the criminal trial of Aaron Thomas. I'm Target 12 investigator Tim White. I'm joined by Eli Sherman for this special. Eli, Aaron Thomas took the stand in his own defense, not something you see very often in a criminal trial. His own lawyer, one of his own lawyers, so there was John McDonald, and then John Calcagni in closing arguments said it is, quote, an absolute rarity for a defendant to take the stand. Remind people why that is.
It's a high risk potential is really the short answer, because a defendant is not required, of course, to take the stand in their own defense, and a jury can't use that. They can't consider that against them if they don't. And what that means is that, it's kind of safe not to have the defendant come up because you don't open them to cross-examination. Because, of course, once you're on the stand, that's when prosecutors also get an opportunity to ask questions in cross-examination. And if they're, there could be any number of liabilities that come with a defendant's testimony that can be picked apart by a prosecution. So you can get caught in a lie. You know, you can be asked something about that you weren't expecting, and it comes out really bad to the jury and can work really against you. I think the defense in this trial really felt like it was their best option to have Aaron Thomas get up there and defend himself, so that, you know, as we boiled it down earlier, it became him versus the former students. It was his testimony against theirs. It muddied the water for the jurors, not just hearing from the former students saying that this was inappropriate, illegal, and potentially legal.
So why don't we take a listen to some of his testimony? As you point out, the big risk is cross-examination by prosecutors. Prosecutors here were Tim Healy and Megan Thompson. You're going to hear the voice of Tim Healy in the story we're about to run. And then there's something called redirect, where Aaron Thomas's defense attorney can then ask more questions of Aaron Thomas. So you're going to hear both of that from this story that we filed on day 4 of him on the stand.
For these kids, are you sorry for what you did, or are you sorry because your lies have finally caught up with you and you're sitting here today?
Aaron Thomas testifying in his own defense, accused of inappropriate contact with students during naked fat testing at North Kingstown High School.
Why? Why did you do that? Why did you lie to Dr. O'Shea?
At the time, my job would have been on the line.
Assistant Attorney General Tim Healy pressed Thomas about why he continued the testing program even after being confronted in 2018.
And you knew it was wrong. You knew we heard from the other teachers, you knew that was something that was wrong, right?
In what sense?
In the sense, Mr. Thomas, in the sense
Yes.
of you being alone in a room with a naked boy. That's what we're talking about. In that sense. You knew that was wrong.
At that time, now that I look back on it, yes, I do.
Then, under more questions from his attorney, John Calcagni,
Did you ever tell any of the kids, hey, don't tell anybody what we're doing in here?
No.
Thomas got emotional on the stand.
So why should we believe you today?
Well, today's different. I'm under oath, which I've said several times, but all the things I was trying to save are gone. I don't teach, I don't coach, I lost my reputation.
So, as you said, Eli, this was a lot about, because there's not a lot of physical evidence, this is a lot about the jury trying to weigh the credibility of the different witnesses that took the stand, some 25 witnesses in all, including Aaron Thomas, by far on the stand, more than any other witness for 5 days. Now, that juror I talked to told me that he did not find Aaron Thomas credible when he took the stand. Largely probably because he had lied previously, which we're going to get to in the program. But I thought this was interesting. Remember, Eli, the judge charges the jury, gives the jury instructions before they go into the room and they deliberate. And one of the things she said, I'm going to read from the transcript of her statement. She said, Judge Melanie Wilk Thunberg, if you should find for any reason that you disbelieve any part of Mr. Thomas's testimony, you cannot convict him on that basis. In other words, you cannot say, oh, he lied. He lied to us. Therefore, he must be guilty. So this just reinforced what you were saying earlier in the show. Beyond a reasonable doubt. I mean, the bar, it's such a high bar. Literally telling the jury, just because you think he lied, you need more. You need more than that in order to convict. I'm hoping that is helping people understand the verdict that came down. Okay, why don't we do this, Eli? As we talked about, this case relied very heavily on witness testimony, not a lot of physical evidence, but there was one key piece of evidence against Aaron Thomas, and that was the police interrogation video. 2021, right? He was interviewed.
Yep, early 2021.
Detective Mulligan at the time is who you're going to see in the video, and it was played to the jury fairly early in the report from that day.
You guys can just sit over there. Yeah.
This video from inside the North Kingstown Police Department in February 2021.
Well, no, it was my idea.
Aaron Thomas being interviewed by detectives with his attorney present. Students have testified that they were asked if they were shy or not shy before being told to get naked.
Do you remember asking him that, though?
I don't remember asking him shy or not shy.
Then he was asked point blank.
Did you ever ask them to take their shorts off and conduct some of the tests without their clothes to get a more accurate reading?
You should be able to get everything by rolling things up.
They didn't have to wear their underwear, just their underwear, or take their shorts off at any point. None of these kids did.
Not Deny. The only thing I'm thinking about is the situation he just brought up about, if they showed up with sweatpants on,
So what would happen, what would be the case then?
that they might have to pull down here on the side so they can take a pinch on the hip.
But multiple students have testified otherwise.
At some point, do you become unclothed?
Yes. It has ruined me.
Some students have also said Thomas would conduct hernia tests on them while naked. Thomas denied that with detectives.
I'm not doing anything like that. That's crazy.
You know, Eli, if the trial had ended right there, maybe the verdict would have been a little bit different. But obviously, you have to think that police video where he clearly lied to police, he had clearly lied to school officials in 2018, that is probably why the defense team said, you know what, Aaron, you got to take the stand in this case.
Yeah, explain to the jury why he lied, right? And his explanation for that was that he feared that he would lose his job. He feared that he wouldn't be able to coach, which was, of course, something that he had done for 28 years. And that definitely probably helped him getting up there and explaining that was the reason, not because he was trying to shield the fact that he was getting, hundreds of former high school students naked inside of his office for these tests.
Yeah, the defense really just embraced, it's almost like an affirmative defense. They embraced the inappropriate parts of his behavior. He was alone with naked students. He lied to police, and they tried successfully, clearly now we know, to give reasoning to all of that. All right, why don't we take a break here? When we come back, the critical closing arguments in this case. Stay with us. Welcome back to this 12 News special, the criminal trial of Aaron Thomas and the naked fat test case. I'm Target 12 investigator Tim White. I'm joined by Eli Sherman. Eli, after 6 weeks, the trial came to a close, as they all do, with closing arguments. This was unusual because of a scheduling with the court. It happened over 2 days. The defense goes first in all criminal trials, and then the state gets the final word, but there was like an evening in between, which is a bit unusual. Who knows if that played to the defense's advantage? Jurors could think about it for a little bit longer. But I want to play some of those closing arguments. John Calcagni went on for about 90 minutes. Megan Thompson for the state went on for about 70. Here's a piece of some of those closing arguments.
The state's case is very strong on negative optics. Absolutely. But I would suggest to you, and will outline for you, that the state's case is weak on actual evidence of criminal conduct. The state has consistently and primarily relied upon two things: that the athletes were naked and Coach Thomas lied. Naked, 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 lied, lied, lied. And that has been the theme of everything the state has had to say. They put up photos of the athletes selectively in their freshman year to try to play on your outrage and your sympathies over how you likely feel about the impropriety of his testing methods. We understand and conceded up front that those methods were in fact inappropriate. We conceded the lies and explained why they occurred. An individual fearful, trying to save his job as a teacher, a desperate measure by a man trying to preserve his identity.
This carefully manufactured image and reputation that he made for himself was absolutely vital for him to be able to abuse and sexually assault all of those boys undetected for nearly 30 years, without question and without consequence. He hopped up on the stand after rehearsing his story and having listened to every former student, including the two victims, where all he did for 5 days, 3 of which was teach you about basketball, the other 2 was he walked himself right to the line of criminality. Admitted that everything these boys said about the test, the pinches, the nakedness, all true. But the moment it steps him over the line into a criminal charge, no way. They're lying or they're confused. Let these boys know that you heard them and do what hasn't been done in the last 30 years. Hold this man accountable for his own actions and find him guilty.
So that was Defense Attorney John Calcagni, followed by State Prosecutor Special Assistant Attorney General Megan Thompson, giving their closing arguments here. As we've talked about the verdict, Eli, not guilty in the 2 felony counts, guilty on 2 misdemeanor charges. And we got some reaction. You actually got this statement from one of the former student athletes who also took the stand, and he wrote to you, an adult teacher coach touching a naked underage student in a locked windowless room during school hours without parental consent is a misdemeanor offense. Let that sink in. If this isn't a wake-up call for us all, I don't know what is. Wake-up call, Eli. He is talking about second-degree sexual assault in the state law here.
Yeah, the statute of limitations on that, the window in which someone can come in and accuse somebody of that charge is 3 years. Mm-hmm. And that's across the country, it's an incredibly brief window for a sexual offense, a sexual assault offense. The Attorney General since 2022 has been trying to change that law. He's trying to expand
Largely because of this case?
Largely because of this case, which of course began with our reporting in 2021. He'd like to expand that from 3 to 10 years, and each year that he's brought that to the legislature has been shot down by lawmakers. A lot of the former students feel like if that statute of limitations was longer, that they would have had their opportunity to come and accuse Thomas, and even the Attorney General has said that there'd be way more charges in the case had that window been larger. And let's remind people, more than 600 people went through this testing program that began in the early 1990s, and 80% of them got naked for the test. That's came from Aaron Thomas himself on the stand. That's a lot of people who didn't get an opportunity to come make any accusations in this because that statute of limitations is only 3 years.
All right, we're coming to nearing the end of our program here, Eli. So I want to do final thoughts. I mean, you and I have been involved in this since 2021. Our investigation dropped in October of 2021, and then it was followed up by the Boston Globe, and other media outlets covered it, and it really upended, criminal trial aside, which is obviously a big deal. It had a huge impact on North Kingstown itself, just the reporting on it.
Yeah, you never really know how a story is going to land, and we took a long time to get this to a point where we felt comfortable enough about making it public. Mm-hmm. And the fallout from it was extraordinary. This is just the criminal trial, but so many administrators at the North Kingstown School District lost their job. There was huge turnover in the school committee. There were protests at a school committee that you covered,
yep.
Tim. And not only was there this criminal investigation, but there was also a U.S. Attorney civil rights investigation that resulted in sort of a consent agreement or agreement and closed. There was a town investigation. And now there are multiple civil lawsuits that former students have filed against the school. 4 civil lawsuits filed against the school district, accusing administrators of not doing enough to protect them from Aaron Thomas. So the fallout has been, extraordinary to watch over the last few years.
And we'll keep an eye on those civil cases, Eli. Aaron Thomas is not yet a defendant in any of those civil cases, we should note. Okay, we started the program with he is scheduled to be sentenced on June 26th, 1 year potential for each of the misdemeanor counts. I'm just going to speculate, which is not something I like to do. I think what we'll hear is the defense is going to ask for a year filing on this, which means if he's a Boy Scout for a year, this likely will get expunged after 1 year. I'm guessing the state, Eli, will ask for 2 years at the ACI, saying, look, he needs to be held accountable for all of this, and we'll see what the judge ultimately does on sentencing day. You and I will both be there, and we'll bring it to everybody. We have complete coverage of the Thomas trial on WPRI.com. You can also watch our original investigation from 2021 and an exclusive sit-down interview that we did with with 5 former student athletes that aired in 2022. That's all on WPRI.com. For Eli Sherman, I'm Tim White. Thanks for watching.